Two bits of Joseph Parker news today. The first one, that he'll be attending the next Klitschko training camp to help Vladimir prepare with sparring for Vladimir's fight on April the 25th. The second bit of news is that Joseph Parker's new opponent has been announced, Jason Pettaway, in a fight that I understand will take place in March. Now, I'm going to be honest, I didn't know Jason Pettaway, and I like to think I've got a fairly decent grasp of who's active in the heavyweight division. I've done a bit of looking into him. His biggest fight was against Magomed Abdusalamov. I've watched that fight. I found a few other clips on YouTube. It's fair to say there isn't too much footage available on the guy. I started off in the obvious place, BoxRec. He's 34 years old. He's ranked the 158th heavyweight out there in the world. So in many ways, you could argue that this guy is a step down from the likes of Sherman Williams, the likes of Beto Costa Jr. You know, this is not a guy who's rated very, very highly indeed. I can't imagine he's rated amongst any of the governing bodies, etc. Now, his record is deceptive. 17 wins with 1 loss. He got knocked out by Abdusalamov in the 4th round of their fight. And of his 17 wins, 10 have come by way of knockout. Now, hear me out on this one. I'm going to talk briefly about his record, then I'm going to talk about his skill set. In terms of his record, the calibre of opponents he's been in with and who he's beaten is very, very poor. He hasn't beaten a single opponent who I would consider top 50. It's debatable whether he's beaten an opponent who could be considered top 100. Since the loss to Abdusalamov, he hasn't gone a lot further than 6 rounds, and he's only faced one opponent who had a winning record, who was 6-5, so hardly a prolific record at that. He's a guy who's largely fought in 6-rounders, 4-rounders against guys with losing records. When he stepped up against Abdusalamov, he got badly knocked out. I've watched the fight, as I say. It's available on YouTube. He's taking heavy punishment. He gets floored once and is then on very, very wobbly legs and gets taken out. However, in that Abdusalamov fight, I thought this guy showed skills that were better than his record and that were better than his rating. This is a guy who, at least in the early rounds of that Abdusalamov fight, I think arguably had the better skills. He's not the most athletic heavyweight you're ever going to see, but the guy can move. He's got a good set of legs on him. He's not a stationary target. He hasn't got the worst hand speed, to be honest, and whilst he doesn't look like he's got particularly heavy hands in terms of his power, he was establishing the jab nicely against Abdusalamov. He was moving nicely. He was counter-punching quite well, I noted. And there were a few times he caught Abdusalamov, even in the first minute of the fight. I thought it was quite eye-catching. You know, he was exposing gaps in Abdusalamov's defence. He was using movement. He was using speed. He also showed me some remnants of an inside game. You know, when the fight got close, he was throwing quite a tasty uppercut on the inside. There was quite a lot to like about the performance. Essentially, he was in against a more heavy-handed guy, and he got tired. His game, which relied on movement, relied on being elusive, wore him out. As we came into the 4th round, there was less movement. He was more stationary, and Abdusalamov was able to expose and exploit gaps in his defence. He was quite vulnerable to a straight cross. You know, he wasn't a guy who was overly hard to hit once the movement ceased. You know, as a moving target, he was just about okay. But as, you know, he got a bit more tired, as it became a sort of more of a dogfight, and as the movement stopped, he became open. He's not a guy who you'd want to see in the corner taking punches, you know, because I don't think his defence is refined enough. He's better when he's on his bike moving. Now, I would presume he will face Joseph Parker in a fight that will be over 10 rounds at least, maybe 12 rounds. And I think that is the major question of this fight, whether the guy turns up in decent shape. Because if he turns up and can fight for 10 rounds like he did against Abdusalamov in rounds 1 and 2, it would be a really, really interesting test for Parker. This guy's got skills. He can counterpunch, he can move, he's got a jab, he's got decent hand speed. As I say, some sort of there's not a huge deal of footage on this guy, but he knows what an inside game looks like. Joseph Parker, in my opinion, hasn't really faced someone with an advanced move and jab game like this guy. He hasn't faced someone who can counterpunch like this guy. I think it has the potential to be a tricky fight. The difficulty is, he lost his fight against Abdusalamov because he came up against a big puncher and he hadn't had the necessary prep for a 10-round fight. There's a lot of similarities between that situation and the situation he now finds himself in with Joseph Parker, because the fights he's taken between the Abdusalamov fight and this haven't prepared him for a 10-round fight. He hasn't gone beyond 6 rounds. He hasn't faced a level of opposition who can test him and who can hurt him and who can expose those gaps in his defence. Now, it may be that on the day, Joseph Parker is just a level above this guy, because Parker can move, Parker can jab, Parker can fight. Parker's he's quicker, he's certainly more powerful. And it may be that Parker's more athletic, more dominant in the early rounds. The guy gets fatigued again, he becomes defensively open, he stops moving, and we could see Parker wipe him out. It's very, very possible that will be the case. It's very hard to make a definitive prediction and judgment as to whether that will be the case, because it's very hard to find footage on this guy, and he hasn't been tested with the right level of opposition to make a fully informed judgment. So I think the sensible prediction is that Parker wins by KO, because I don't think the guy certainly hasn't proved that he can go 10 rounds, and he hasn't proved that he can last against a guy who hits as hard as Parker or Abdusalamov, in my opinion. However, what I will say, if I was in Team Parker, if I was managing Joseph Parker, this would not be a fight that I would choose. Let me tell you why. This guy, Jason Pettaway, is not known amongst boxing fans. He's not someone who's going to bring a huge audience with him. He's not someone fans will be queuing around the block to see. He is a semi-unheard of guy within the division, in my point of view. He's also very lowly rated. He hasn't been in with a decent level of opposition. He's not rated amongst the governing bodies. Beating this guy will not get Parker soaring up the heavyweight rankings. So, what I'm getting at is, in many ways, the reward isn't there. It's not going to be a big money fight. It's not going to generate a huge level of interest. The guy isn't going to get Parker moving up the rankings. And it's a fight that everyone will be certain that Parker will win. Nobody will give this guy a chance against Joseph Parker. I imagine he would be a ridiculously short-priced favourite with bookmakers and with casinos, etc. So, what I see is, I don't see any reward with this guy. He's a lesser-known guy than someone like Sherman Williams, Brian Minto. But I think potentially he could be more dangerous. Now, I'm not saying he's got what it takes to beat Parker. What I am saying is, in the first few rounds of the Abdusalamov fight, he's showing us certain traits that are potentially worrying. And you'd have to wonder if this guy turns up ready for the fight of his life, in shape for 10 rounds, and he's certainly been given enough notice. The fight's being announced now to take place in March. If he can get himself in that shape, if he can move like that for 10 rounds, if he can jab like that, counterpunch like that, throw uppercuts like that for 10 rounds, it's going to be a real test for Parker. I like to see heavyweights tested. I'm not saying I wouldn't take this fight because it's a test, because I think a guy needs a test to avoid a situation like Deontay Wilder, where you're fighting for the world title without any sort of real level of opposition on your CV. The guy needs a test, but I think the way to build a test is by putting him in with guys like Kevin Johnson, Freza Quendo, maybe guys like Nascimento, established journeymen who aren't necessarily going to come to beat him. Joseph Parker, to me, has, and I've said this before, I was very, very impressed by his performance against Beto Jr. in his last fight. I thought it was a far more professional performance. But as recently as 2 fights ago, Parker was against Williams. Parker was giving me concerns defensively. I thought he had vulnerabilities and was too open. I thought if someone like Sherman Williams can catch you with a slow, big, looping hook, what is a world-class heavyweight going to do? I also think Parker's got a tendency to get involved in a scrap unnecessarily. He's got good boxing skills, a good jab, good legs, and I think he should use that and rely on that more. Look at one of his early fights, I forget the guy's name, where he got badly cut, needlessly. Parker was well above the guy in terms of skill level, but got himself sucked into a war, got badly hurt, and that fight could have gone a different way. So, Parker's going to need to be on his A-game here. He's not going to be able to allow defensive slip-ups. I don't think the guy, has massive power to be afraid of, but this guy is a reasonably able counterpuncher, and you don't want him just to be able to move and wait till Parker dives in and then catch him with the counterpunch. So Parker needs to be on his A-game. We need a Beto Costa Jr. performance, and then I'm confident Parker wins. But for me, the risk-reward just isn't there. Parker may go out and knock this guy out in 2 or 3 rounds. The guy may not turn up conditioned, even though he's got the time. But for me, the guy's got skills, and he's a guy you're not going to get any recognition or any praise for beating. It's expected Parker will beat him. So I think it's potentially an interesting fight. How well it sells on the pay-per-view system they have out there, I don't know. How well it will move him up the governing bodies and their ranking systems, I don't know. But if this guy, Jason Pettaway, turns up in shape and fights like he did in the Abdusalamov fight, I think he could take a few rounds off Parker, and I think it could become a really interesting fight. Based on what I've seen, based on the form that's in the book, the guy's been knocked out every time he stepped up when he stepped up in class. He's got slight defensive vulnerabilities himself. And if Parker can put a professional performance he did like against Beto Jr., I think Parker beats Jason Pettaway, even if Pettaway turns up in the best shape of his life. It's an interesting fight though, and I think it's interesting that Parker will go to Klitschko training camp. It'd be really, really good for him to get some work in with the champion. Really, really good for him to get more experience fighting taller guys. He's certainly going to need to do that at some point throughout his career. Let me know your thoughts. I know Parker's a very popular guy in the boxing community. I'm keen if anyone else has got thoughts on Jason Pettaway. Let me know. Thanks very much for watching.